Welcome to TechWire, a conversation about government, technology, and policy in California. My name is Christina Gagne, and today I'm joined by Jeetu Patel, the General Manager of the Simplicity Business Unit in EMC. Jeetu, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Christina.
So you've been a speaker here at the conference today and focusing sort of on how government is transitioning into the mobile environment.
Yes.
How has the IT landscape shifted over the last 10, 20 years, and how has it brought us to where we are today?
Yeah, so let's even take something as recent as 5 years and how the IT landscape shifted in that amount of time. So some major kind of seismic shifts that have gone on, right? So if you take the first one, on average, people have about 3 to 7 devices, and they want to make sure that those devices are bring your own devices, so people go out and pay for themselves. Most corporations and organizations aren't supplying these to the users, they're going out and bringing it themselves, but corporate data resides in them, so there's a huge security exposure, and there's a huge usability and productivity loss if you don't provide them tools to work on those devices. So that's the first one. The second area that we see a huge amount of shift in the IT landscape is versus 5 years ago, there's this whole notion of consumerization of IT, where the user is taking control and IT has to make sure that their organization is secure from an enterprise perspective, but the users need to be productive. If you don't provide users those productivity tools, users are going out and provisioning it themselves with consumer-grade tools, which provide massive exposure to the organization as you move forward, right? And then the third one is around this whole notion of expectation from the user, where things just have to be easy to use and no longer are cryptic kind of, Soviet-era style interfaces, as one of my competitors talks about, acceptable in the marketplace. It has to be much more of a delightful user experience, and with the absence of that, adoption doesn't occur as you move forward. Now, the last piece, which is interesting, is the refactoring because of the cloud. Everything's changing. So these systems have now started to get built out with a large amount of information that needs to get consumed by a large number of people, and hundreds of thousands of users need to get onboarded within a very short amount of time. It's slightly different from the way that enterprise systems used to work in the past. So these are some fundamental shifts going on, because of which there has to be a refactoring from the suppliers and how they think about delivering technology, and the buyers and how they think about consumption of the technology.
And these shifts will markedly impact both the public and private sector. But the difference between the two is a private sector company might have 50,000 people, and you're talking about IT and mobility.
Yeah.
You shift to the state of California, 39 million people in their information.
Yeah.
So what are the differences between the public and private sector, and what are things that maybe one sector has to think about that the other doesn't?
Yeah, so in the private sector, you're starting to see that the boundaries within the organization are also changing. So if you might have 50,000 employees within an organization, but now people want to share information with folks outside the organization just as seamlessly as they want to within the organization. So you are starting to see that inter-company communication within the private sector is also scaling. But I agree with you. On the public sector, the challenge is even more complex, because the licensing and pricing models that you might have let's say you take a per-user licensing model, you can't really deploy that in the state of California if the state of California wants to go out and communicate with its citizens with certain systems, where now 39 million people need to go out and be consumption points for that information. You can't charge a license fee for 39.4 million people.
I'd hope not.
Right. And so there has to be an effective way to go out and have pricing models that are amenable for the state of California, but also profitable for the supplier. And so this whole notion of having a freemium-based offering so that the consumers can go out and, in a frictionless way, download capabilities that they can start using on their devices, but still have the information be securely communicated to them, and the state of California making sure that they can have some level of certainty in how the intellectual property is protected, are all things that need to be thought through as you move into this new model.
Now, your company has a focus on mobility and security, and in terms of the intersection of those two things, what are just some examples for our audience of where things go awry? Maybe just some granular, day-to-day. I think a lot of times we get we're in these high-level conversations that are very important, and then people are like, well, that doesn't apply to me. So how does it apply to the individual worker or whoever's involved in the equation?
Let's take a simple example. The business unit that I run is called Simplicity, which is the file, sync, and share unit, right? And if you think about the reason that we entered into this market is our customers started asking us, saying, my users love Dropbox, but it's such a massive exposure for me as an organization that I just can't deal with that risk. It's users go out and use Dropbox, all of a sudden the ownership of data shifts from the organization to the user. If a user leaves the organization or the institution or an agency in government, now that data goes with them rather than some way for IT to control that data. So there's a huge amount of security exposure that was there, and no longer were you able to go out and just have a strategy to lock people down, because what do people do? They find a way around it. Right? So if you say, okay, I'm going to lock you down from my VPN so you can't go out and access Dropbox, they go out and bring their MiFi devices. And now all of a sudden they're able to go out and use the MiFi devices to use these consumer-based tools. And the reason they're using consumer-based tools is because they make them more productive. So rather than fighting that, I think what enterprise-class vendors have to do is figure out a way that the user experience is just as delightful, but that the choice isn't something that's required for organizations to be made between, do I keep my information secure and protected versus do I keep my users productive? That's an inherently unhealthy choice to make that you should just eliminate and say you should keep your users productive and you should keep your information secure, and it's not an either-or decision. And so that's the central theme that we are focused on and maniacally kind of obsessed to solve for customers, is how do we create a delightful experience so users get productive in doing things that they expect to do on a daily basis in a frictionless way, while keeping their IT and organizational constituencies at rest, that it's not going to be intellectual property exposure to them as they move forward.
So we talked a little bit about how the landscape has shifted over the last 10 to 20 years.
Yeah.
But what's next? As an expert in this field, what do you think is coming next in mobility?
Yeah. So the beauty about this is we're just getting started in mobility. So if you look at where the 3 or 4 areas where there's going to be huge amounts of innovation, right? The first amount of innovation is going to be in user experience. I still think, by and large, across the board, my grandmother doesn't find using computers simple. There's on a daily basis, my mother, who's about 74 years old now, uses the iPad, but probably a fraction of the functionality because she still finds it confusing. And that's a good reminder for me that there's innovation that needs to be done on the user experience side in a material way. Even though all of us in the tech industry think we've come a long way, we're just getting started. Right? The second area where innovation is going to happen is just truly understanding behavior of users. So the nice part about SaaS and mobility is you are now able to get a far deeper understanding of how usage actually occurs with systems rather than in the past, where you're able to monitor by click what people are doing, aggregate that information and say, I'm going to move away from this notion of I'm going to keep jamming features that people want to use that no one ends up using. So we call this whole notion that a lot of renowned authors have called kind of the performance surplus, right, or the consumption gap, where you might give way too much capability to the user, but they don't give it to them in a way that's usable, and now all of a sudden you only use 5% of the capability that's available. How do you get 95% of the capability that can be utilized in your system, and how do you surface the right things? So that's an area where there's a huge amount of innovation that's going to go on, is how do you make sure that there's analytics in place to understand what people are using and not using, and de-feature the stuff that people aren't using so that you don't inundate and complexify the experience. The third area that there's a lot of innovation going on that we're leading the charge in, we believe, is in the whole notion of security. How do you keep security and compliance are two very different things, but both of those, how do you keep an organization secure? How do you make them compliant so that there's data residency laws, data sovereignty laws, there's all of those aspects can be well thought through so that large organizations that do have exposures and that do have regulations that kind of restrict them are able to go out and adhere to those while keeping their users productive, and that we can continue to get to be a more productive nation and an organization as time goes on. So, if I were to sum it up, huge innovation in the user experience side, huge innovation in data analytics, huge innovation in just scaling of infrastructure and making sure that applications get to be consumer grade. Those are all areas that the industry at large is working on that we're excited to participate in. and take leadership.
Great. Well, Jeetu, thanks for joining me and sharing your expertise.
Thank you for having me, Stephen.
And thank you to our audience for joining us once again in a conversation about technology, policy, and government in California.